My message this morning is called Loving Through the Years, and in that spirit, I'd like to share a reading this morning that is a playful and I think poignant poem about the joys and challenges of loving through the years. It's called What the Longlyweds Know. Not the newlyweds, the longlyweds. It's by Leah Furness. The longlyweds know that it isn't about the golden anniversary at all, but about all the unremarkable years that Hallmark doesn't even make a card for. It's about the second anniversary when they were surprised to find they cared for each other more than last year. And the fourth, when both kids had chicken pox and she threw her shoe at him for no apparent reason. And the sixth, when he accidentally got drunk on the way home from work because being a husband and father was so damn hard. It's about the 11th, 12th, and 13th years when they discovered they could survive a crisis. And the 22nd anniversary when they looked around at each other across the empty nest and found it good. It's about the 37th year when she finally decided she could never change him. And the 38th, when he decided a little change wasn't so bad after all. It's about the 46th anniversary when they both bought cards and forgot to give them to each other. But most of all, it's about the end of the 49th year when they discovered you don't have to be old to have your 50th anniversary. The longlyweds. So over the years, I found that there are some folks in every congregation who each week need to be able to take away something from the sermon that's very concrete, at least one concrete piece of advice. Something tangible, something practical, something they can apply directly to their own lives. And if they don't get that piece of advice, well then maybe they feel a little cheated on Sunday mornings. So this Sunday, let me just go ahead and get that out of the way right here at the beginning by offering this concrete piece of relationship advice to all of you. My advice is this: never refinance your home on your anniversary, okay? That's right, I speak from hard-won experience on this. Not long ago, as interest rates fell, my husband Chris and I decided that it was time to refinance our home, or as the lenders like to say, to refi. So we went to a lender and filled out the forms and ran the numbers and got the appraisal and credit check and did all those things you have to do to refi. But it's probably more accurate to say that actually I did all of those things. Because at the time, Chris was teaching for a semester out in California, and so I was the one in DC who had to make the refi happen. In fact, the only thing that Chris had to do in all of this was to complete and fax to the lender a power of attorney so that we could close on the mortgage without him being there, so I could sign for him, right? Well, our closing date was set and happened to fall on April 28th, which is the date that we celebrate our anniversary. I got up early that morning and made my way out to suburban Maryland, to Bethesda, where I sat down at a conference table with a huge stack of papers, and everything was going smoothly until the lender looked at me and said, "Where's the power of attorney?" "Well, didn't Chris fax it to you?" I said. "No," she said. "Well, you know what I did then." It's the same thing that you would have done in my position. I pulled out my phone and I called Chris all the way out in San Francisco. Now, it was about 9 a.m. on the East Coast, which made it 6 a.m. out west, a fact I hadn't considered when I dialed, nor had I remembered that morning that it was our anniversary. So after a few rings, the call went to voicemail, and I left a message that, well, you can probably imagine the message that I left. Where's the power of attorney? Meanwhile, in San Francisco, Chris awoke to a buzzing, vibrating cell phone. And when he saw that I'd left a message, he thought to himself, how sweet. Rob called to wish me a happy anniversary, and he called early to make sure that his was the first voice I heard on our anniversary day. Yeah, you can imagine his disappointment then when instead of hearing the words, happy anniversary, he got my rant about the power of attorney. Now himself enraged, Chris called me back and in a voice dripping with sarcasm said to me, well, happy power of attorniversary to you too. And it was just at that moment that the lender came rushing back into the office to say, oops, my bad, he faxed me the power of attorney anyways. So there you have it. Don't say I didn't ever give you any free relationship advice. Loving through the years. It's a little bit like that, isn't it? This morning I want to invite us to consider the relationships in our lives that have lasted, that have endured the test of time. Maybe it's a relationship with a spouse or partner, but maybe not. Maybe it's with close family members or friends, or maybe a relationship with a community like the church. Any close, loving relationship that's lasted through the years. What made it work? You know, I'll say that for me, I feel like it's a minor miracle that any relationship lasts for the long haul, given all the careless and sometimes hurtful things that we can do to the people we love the most. Right? We make mistakes all the time in our relationships. Now, if we're lucky, we can laugh about these things later, like with the refi. But sometimes, let's face it, we can't. And then for the relationship to survive, we've got to return to that deep reservoir of compassion and forgiveness, the one that we've gone back to over and over again through the years, the one without which ours or any long-term relationship, without which it can't survive. For me, it's poignant and sometimes painful to observe how desperately we human beings need each other, yet how easily and often we push one another away. Somehow, after thousands and thousands of years of human evolution, we're still a little maladapted to a task that is central to our happiness and well-being. How can it be that after all this time, we're still beginners when it comes to love? If you ever feel like throwing up your hands and saying, why is this so hard? Well, then trust me, you're not alone. Now, I've invited us this morning to reflect on the long-term relationships in our lives. But I also this morning want to lift up another important relationship for all of you. Because in September, the Reverend Janet Newton arrives to be your minister. And if all goes according to hope and plan, she'll remain your minister for a good long while. It'll be a long-term relationship. And so even as we think about our own relationships this morning, you might consider what it would take for you as a congregation to prepare for a long and healthy and fruitful relationship with Reverend Janet. Speaking as a minister who just completed a nearly 20-year relationship with a congregation, and I see some of my former parishioners there on Zoom, I can vouch for, and I hope they can too, I can vouch for how enriching and transformative such a relationship can be. So what are some helpful ways we can nurture these relationships in our lives? Well, first of all, friends, I think we've got to consciously and mindfully push back against a prevailing culture that treats everything and everyone as replaceable, as disposable. When Apple makes my iPhone, they deliberately make it not to last. They plan for it to be obsolete within a few years so that I got to buy another one, right? Disposability of products and of labor, which is to say people, is one of the engines that keeps capitalism turning. On top of this, we know that social media is constantly drawing our attention and interest to what's hashtag trending, or to the next bright new thing. We deceive ourselves if we think that these cultural patterns don't impact us and our relationships. As I struggle in the midst of all this to greater intention and mindfulness in my relationships, I find it helpful to think about relationship building as a kind of spiritual practice, a focused attention to the other, a slow and deliberate practice of always learning how to love better. Because people aren't disposable, it turns out. Nor are our hearts disposable. Nor are relationships. Even when they must end, and sometimes they must, even when they must end, they're not disposable. And neither are our fellow congregants and ministers. As you prepare to welcome Reverend Janet, I encourage you to mindfully resist a narrative that says, here at UUSMV, the ministers are just passing through. I've heard that sentiment on more than one occasion this year. It expresses itself in different ways. I've heard, with housing prices the way they are, we'll never find a minister who can afford to stay, as if that were fate. Or there's a story that goes, we're just a small congregation. Maybe we're not really worthy of a minister who will stick with us. Or I've heard a story about trust. Ministers, can't really count on them to stick around. I've even once or twice heard the narrative of disposability creep in. Maybe it's better that ministers come and go, because then if we don't like them, we can always replace them with another one. I don't believe this is the prevailing sentiment in the congregation, but I didn't just make that up either. I've heard each of those comments this year, and I'm just asking us to be aware of them and to not let stories like these unconsciously undermine your opportunity to build a rich and long-term relationship with your next minister. One concrete way to push back on this narrative is to right from the beginning, go all in on the relationship, right? To invest in this new relationship from the get-go. Think about it. When we meet someone new in our lives that we're interested in, a potential friend or possible future partner, we want to get to know that person and be known by that person. Spend time with them It's the same with a new minister. Ask yourself, what can I do? What can we do starting right now to build a foundation of a long-term relationship with Reverend Janet? Ask her what she thinks is important to building that kind of relationship. Getting off to a good start is critical to any long-term relationship. Communicating about that is critical. Now, often when a new minister arrives, there is a kind of what we call a honeymoon period, right? A time when everyone gets along really well and things are going just swimmingly. We sometimes have that in our own relationships, right? A little honeymoon period. But as we look farther down the road, I just want to remind us that any long-term relationship is bound to disappoint us at one time or another. And one of the critical questions that we will ask ourselves in any relationship is what we're going to do when our heart gets broken for the first time. What are we going to do when we're disappointed for the first time? Because a minister is sometimes going to let you down. You know, a call doesn't get returned. Something they say in a sermon hurts us. A boundary is set with us that makes us feel a little rejected, maybe. It's all part of the relationship, friends. I want to encourage you to hang in there through disappointment. As a minister, I've always appreciated the times when people have cared enough about their relationship with me to communicate their disappointment clearly and honestly and directly. Right? And when they've assumed the good intentions of me and other leaders in the church and have genuinely sought to restore right relationship. On the other hand, when folks go talking to other people, right? Or at the first sign of disappointment, write their resignation letter to the congregation. Well, there's not much I can do about that, is there? There's not much I can do in that situation. I think this is a good question for us to ask more broadly. How do we handle disappointments in our relationship? What's our pattern for reacting to and responding to those disappointments? How do we communicate about them? And then how do we recommit? You know, at least once every year, I invite the congregations I serve to recite a reading in the back of our hymnal called the Litany of Atonement. We've read it together at least once this year. It's the one whose refrain goes, "We forgive ourselves, we forgive each other, we begin again in love." I offer that to you as a mantra in your own relationships. I forgive myself. I forgive you, beloved. Let's begin again in love. And I encourage you to return to it with some regularity as you move forward in this next chapter of your ministry. It's not a bad way to live with one another. Finally, I just want to say something about renewal. Whenever I've had the opportunity to talk with couples who've been married a long time, I always am sure to ask them, how many marriages have you really had over this one marriage, right? In other words, how many times have you renegotiated this relationship? And they invariably say, oh, we've had 5 or 6 different marriages over the course of our marriage. Any long-term relationship gets renegotiated and renewed periodically because we change and our circumstances change. Sometimes couples are really intentional about this. They'll honor it by rewriting their vows and renewing their vows in front of a community or in front of a minister or just to one another. The same has got to be true for a minister in a congregation. In my 20 years at All Souls, I can think of at least 3 or 4 different ministries that I had there. Different seasons of the ministry. Each one required a kind of intentional renewal or renegotiation with the congregation. It's one reason ministers try to take a sabbatical every 5 or 7 years or so. It's an opportunity for the minister and the congregation to reflect, renegotiate, and most importantly, to recommit. You know, it's just like those Longlyweds in the poem this morning, whose relationship kept getting renegotiated in all those off years, the ones that Hallmark doesn't write the card about. Our love at the 5th anniversary is not like our love at the 12th, is it? Or the 27th, or the 45th. Happy 45th anniversary, by the way, to Judy and Ted Crawford. Celebrated on the 4th of July. Let me close with this. A long time ago, someone who was struggling in their relationship with God came to me and asked, Rob, what does the love of God look like? Give me an image so I know it if I see it. The question caught me off guard. What does the love of God look like? Is it like being bathed in a warm ray of light? Is it a deep sense of peace and centeredness? It's different for everyone. But this was the answer I gave. For me, the love of God looks like the face of a loved one who has known me for years, who knows the good, the bad, and the ugly, and whose face, nevertheless, shines back on me with love. Let me say that again. I believe that the love of God looks most like the face of one who has loved you for years. Let's just say it, who's loved you long enough to know better, yet whose face still smiles back on you with love. It's a face of forgiveness, of faithfulness, and of abiding commitment. And it's the closest I've ever come to knowing the face of God. Yeah, these long-term relationships, they're a lot of work. But for this, they're worth it. Amen.